Good morning and afternoon, everyone, from wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for your interest in part 2 of our Lunchtime Digest webinar. My name is Christine, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to run you guys through some of our housekeeping rules. First and foremost, everyone will be muted throughout this session, and if you have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to ask them in the questions window, and we will get to them towards the end of our session during Q&A. All right, let's get this session rolling with 3 poll questions first, shall we? We really like you to generously share your opinion with us. And here we go, the first question, launching it right now. So in times like these, how fast and accurate foresight is to your role and function? We have about 45 seconds and we're about 30 seconds left. All right, see a lot of people sending through their answers. Thank you guys. We're about 10 seconds left before we close the poll. So get all of your votes in. All right, we're closing in 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And while we're still on this topic of a fast-changing environment, here's another question for everyone. So currently, in uncertain times, are you actually asked to provide more agile and robust forecast scenarios to your stakeholders? And if yes, how do you think? And if not, why so? So we're also about 15 seconds in, we're about 30 seconds left. So get your votes in now. Wow, interesting to see quite a large number of people do agree that you do have to act a lot faster. We're about 10 seconds left, so do get your votes in as soon as possible before we close off in about 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you, everybody. And now, finally, we just have one last question for you guys. And here we go with the last question. Similarly, about 45 seconds for you. How easy is it right now for you to actually provide agile and robust scenarios with your current process and tools? Do you actually think it's a walk in the park? Or do you think it's an uphill task? Or is it clearly just impossible for you to even get any forecast done? All right, so we're about 20 seconds left. Please do get your votes in. All right, we're about 10 seconds left. And we're closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Great. Thank you everyone for your answers. While we can see that at least 80% of the people do agree that it is an uphill task to actually have to work faster and for them to provide scenarios to their stakeholders, especially with like the tools and the processes that they have in place. Well, that being said, with current fast-changing landscape and dynamics of the markets, we know that plans, budgets, forecasts, and reforecasts are constantly changing in today's environment. And this is actually putting a lot of pressure on FP&A and planning teams. So it is important to test your financial position against multiple scenarios, and the only way to find your way forward in times like these. So today we actually want to show you how predictive forecasting and AI can do this with you. But before we do that, I just wanted to bring you guys to share with you a little bit more about who and what is Jedox. So we are a German-based company that was founded in 2002, headquartered in Freiburg. We are built on an open source platform with almost 250 talented individuals who are working diligently at improvising our craft. And we want to ensure that we are delivering leading edge technology in integrated business planning space so that we can help customers make insight-driven decisions. We are present in APAC with offices in Singapore, Melbourne, and Sydney. We do have a growing list of more than 2,500 happy customers, some of which are listed here, who believe in better planning and are entrusting Jedox with their financial data to perform their frequent budgeting and planning cycles. And that being said, amid this fast-changing and dynamic market, how can you and your team work faster to adapt to uncertainties? Well, last week, we addressed it by sharing with everyone how automating your planning processes can help with surviving uncertain times with quicker and immediate actions. And now that you've adapted, how are you supposed to sustain business continuity? Well, that's what we're all here for today. And in today's session, we'd like to present David Upton and Arun Garudadri, both of who have a wealth of experience and insights on how you and your team can accelerate your budgeting and forecasting work, providing continually updated business information that your business stakeholders can then incorporate into an integrated forecast. Now allow me to hand over the time to David. David, please.
Thank you very much, Christine, and good morning and good afternoon all. For today's webinar, our predictive scenario planning use case is set firmly within the context of our uncertain times. The storm here is not the health crisis, but the ensuing economic crisis, whose leading indicators and signals we can really see around us, both globally and locally. What we're talking about is change. We are facing unprecedented change. Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said that we've had about 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. And unlike 2009, which was the last once in a 100-year crisis, which left really a lot of Asia Pacific region relatively unscathed, this time around it has the potential to reach further, deeper, and a lot of industries are struggling to stay open for business. So as the crisis unfolds, we do need new types of heroes. We've got health heroes, logistic heroes, people in mission critical roles. But at the same time, when companies are battling for their very survival, what about the unsung heroes in FP&A, in supply and operations planning, in workforce planning, folks whose scenarios are used by critical decisions by your CEO and your executive team and can directly affect the lives of hundreds or even thousands of other employees. So in today's webinar, we lay down a question. What kind of role are you going to play? Do you sit on the sidelines? Certainly, we're going to be looking at AI. It's a very powerful tool to help you make better decisions, but it's really up to you to step up and say, we need this now in your organization. But let's kick off by looking at some of today's issues. First up is demand. Now, we all know demand's gone haywire, but let's look at one of the implications of this shifting demand and just around commodity prices. Within the last month, there was a moment where $1 would buy you a can of soft drink or a barrel of West Texas Intermediate. In fact, the prices went negative at one point. Now, certainly for us, one of our customers in the energy and resources sector is reevaluating their high cost projects and their investments. Traditionally, they only made decisions based on production impact without really understanding the cost impact. And they're finding they need to rethink their planning models as a result. The next is the lens is supply. So we've all experienced probably the most stark example of the vulnerabilities in our supply chain, which is the empty fridge in the supermarket. But not only are we finding it in our local grocers, countries themselves are realizing that key infrastructure and areas like water filtration and the chemicals used in those processes also expose them to vulnerabilities. There was a study in Australia put together by a defence think tank which identified that key chemicals used in our water treatment plants run out within days and some of them within weeks. In our experience, one of our customers in the life science area whilst they've got a big spike in their demand, they've faced acute disruption with the cold chain requirements, because they've got very strict requirements on raw materials, and therefore it's made them quite exposed. So now they're looking at planning models so they can answer deeper questions like, what is the impact on our supply side if we increase production by 30%? The third lens is looking at liquidity and working capital. And this really is where it comes down to roost in most organizations. On the one hand, there's still a lot of money awash in the system, whether it's the government's stimulus packages or private equity firms or credit funds ready to find bargains and fund distressed debt. When you actually look down into portfolio companies, they're really focused on keeping the lights on. One of our customers in this area, and I would say, like many organizations, is facing many weeks of poor trading, mounting work in progress balances, staff quarantine, and what they're realizing is they need to bring a cash culture to the business and the planning process, not just P&L and metrics, but cash. And they're also facing more scrutiny of their joint ventures, special purpose vehicles. So there's a lot of focus in overcoming the poor cost visibility and addressing issues around cost equivalence. So if that's the world that we're now living in, and it is continuously changing, what does it mean for us, for folks who are planning and forecasting our scenarios? Let's take a look at some of the barriers or challenges that make that difficult. The first challenge is really us humans. Frankly, we're pretty poor at planning. We suffer from bias. We're not very good at remembering the past with accuracy, and we're even worse at imagining the future. If you've never read Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a great book and I encourage you to do so. There are a lot of good examples there. The second challenge is that sometimes we need to go deep on our data. We need to look through the looking glass and find the truth in the detail. Simple example is, if I'm planning a department for sporting equipment and I've got fishing gear and home gyms on the same shelf, I'm missing some pretty important detail where one's out of stock and the other one hasn't shifted in months. It's like whether your closing balance has a positive or negative figure in your spreadsheet. Those little things can make a big difference. Now, flip side to that is when you step back. You need to see the whole forest, not just the trees, to understand the broader trends and forces at play. If you're a logistics company that hedged against oil price rises, or an airline, you didn't take into account the current spot prices, you'd be missing some important macroeconomic information. As Arun, who you'll be hearing from later on, described to me this morning, a lot of little drops make an ocean. At the same time, our thinking and our actions when we're thinking about planning is also constrained by the tools that we use. The truth is, a lot of us are still big spreadsheet users, and historically, collaboration, version control challenges were really tough, and that was when we were sitting in the same office. But when the other person is sitting on their sofa trying to homeschool their 6-year-old while the other 2-year-old is putting books into the oven, true story, the whole problem gets a lot more challenging. So this is where we unveil our newest technology that helps you, frankly, in the war against uncertainty. And Arun will shortly be showing us how you can take a model from a marketplace and use connectors to bring your data into that on many different examples. What I'm going to be talking about before we get there is some of the outcomes that this delivers for you. The first one is objectivity. So it helps you systematically deal with bias. You can add rigor, and at the same time, you can add governance into your models. You can also collaborate in real time with enterprise controls like audit and workflow. So you've got a lot more confidence in your numbers. The next point is that you can go deep. And what we mean by this is that you connect directly to underlying data sources. So you're not just planning at high-level assumptions, but you're getting a much more operational picture about what's happening. So you think of the planning process on the right-hand side there. If you're planning with assumptions, you're really working with the iceberg above the waterline. With predictive, you've got the ability of going a lot deeper into your data. A finance view might take a view like this, where we've got liquidity based on high-level assumptions, balance sheet, for example. But underneath each of these revenue and costs are operational activities, operational drivers. And the relationship between these is a lot more nuanced, and this can tell you a different story. We're considering our store opening hours when we reopen them. We can flow that directly through to our variable labor hours, as a simple example. The third point of how predictive helps you is not just taking a history and being more robust about pushing that forward. It also enables you to go broad with your data. That means that you can balance strategic and operational cost imperatives within your models. So if you think about that example that we saw a moment ago, everything in the middle of the diagram really was looking inwards inside the organization. What the activities that we're doing? What's our data telling us? But with driver-based predictive, you can bring in macroeconomic drivers, you can bring in social drivers, you can bring in a picture of what your supply chain is looking like, as well as consumer sentiment and demand. This enables you to have a much stronger and robust view, not just of what might be happening tomorrow, but what might happen next month, next year. So now we're moving along to our live scenario, and soon I'll be handing over the reins or the bicycle steering wheel or handlebars to Arun to take over. I'd like just to set the scene with our case study today. Now, Biker's Best, it's a Jedox classic story. It was founded in the late 90s by a couple of hipsters, and they've expanded into providing bicycles for different groups of the community, including mountain bikes and family bikes and home gyms. But like many other retailers, they're hurting. They're looking at shuttering their doors permanently on many of their stores. On one hand, bicycles have experienced a surge in demand as people are getting outdoors more to be healthy. On the other hand, they were unprepared for that, having underinvested in their digital channels. They'd also found that they were unprepared for the different demand on different product categories. They had stock outs. Their doors were shuttered on many stores, which meant that they were still paying overheads on those. And their workforce productivity plummeted as a result. So they're at a bit of a crisis point with a perfect storm of eroding margins and cash, a need to really bolster the capital investment and embrace digital and online, but no funding to do that. And the only way to do that is by actually reducing their cost base. They're also seeing an accelerating trend that's happening across retail, which is that shift to online. One study I read showed that each year since 2010, about 1% more of traffic or transactions were taking place through e-commerce, but in the last couple of months, that's gone up another 10%. So that means we've had 10 years of change compressed into 2 months. So that's the situation for our organization, Biker's Best. I'd like to introduce the main character in our story, and that's Sam on the left-hand side here. Now, Sam's a business planner. She is a planning professional. She's been working in this area for many years. She understands both the operational side of the business, the sales side, as well as the finance. She does love spreadsheets, and she needs to urgently provide some scenarios to the CFO. By the way, she's working from home. With that, I'd like to hand over to Arun to take us through a live demonstration.
Thank you, David. So, as David has already alluded to, Sam is now pressed with the task of forecasting what the uncertain future looks like for her organization, Bikers Best, particularly given the economic uncertainty with the COVID-19 situation that we're all faced with at the moment. I wanted to start off with by just giving you a bird's eye view of what the drivers and what the driver tree looks like for the organization Bikers Best that we're looking at. It's a pretty classic structure where you've got your gross profit broken down into, let's say, your revenue and expense lines. And the focus for today's conversation is all around how revenue can be managed and forecasted. We can also see there's a whole host of other drivers on the cost side, from materials and procurement perspective to the labor that's also being impacted by the situation that we have at the moment. Now, if we think about traditionally what Sam would do in a forecasting scenario such as this, she'd probably leverage a lot of the existing information that they had within the business. This could take the form of prior history, actuals, performance. But traditionally, she's only had access to higher level data. So not at that store and that product level. Typically, it's at a higher level. And as a result, she does not have the necessary visibility in order to plan more accurately, given the current situation. So one of the key things we wanted to help to make Sam's life easier is provide her with the access, the granular data around all of the stores and channels, as well as all of the products broken down into the various product categories. Now, in a classic integrated business planning solution, Sam would want to plan for all the operational drivers, so things like the price, the units, the labor across all of the stores and products. And then she'd want to align a lot of these operational drivers back to the financial view of the world to align and inform strategy with the operational information. So what we've done here is we've taken advantage of, as David mentioned earlier, deeper data at a more granular level, as well as wider or broader data that we can leverage. So what we'll talk about is how we can take a lot of both internal and external data, things like case information, testing that is being conducted around the current COVID-19 situation, and how we can leverage this information to make a more informed and agile prediction for Sam. So what we'll do to start off with is we'll take a look at our predictive planning solution. Now, Jedox has the AI-assisted planning module that's accessible to customers and Jedox users. And what the solution is meant to do is it's meant to take an existing data set, an existing Jedox model, and guide the user through a step-by-step wizard and allow the user to take advantage of the predictive capabilities built into the Jedox platform. There's a whole host of models being worked on, but there's two models that are currently available that we'll tackle. The first one is what we call the time series prediction, and the second one is the driver-based prediction. So what is the time series prediction? Time series prediction helps address the depth criteria. So if we think about how Sam's currently dealing with planning at a higher level, which abstracts away a lot of the granular detail, the devil tends to be in the details. Right? So time series prediction says, let's leverage all the data that we have for not only past years, but within this financial year, and let's use that as a basis for predicting future performance. Now, under normal circumstances, what that allows Sam to do is it allows her to, instead of going through a manual process, it allows her to more quickly predict what the future could look like based on prior performance. But as we already know, given the current situation, prior performance is no longer the most reliable predictor of future performance. So while the time series prediction and all of its capability internally can help somebody like Sam under normal circumstances, we need something a little bit different. So the proverbial solution, the proverbial magic that Sam is going to take advantage of for today's conversation is the driver-based predictive model. So what does the driver-based predictive model do ahead of the time series prediction, in addition to the time series prediction? So what the driver-based predictive model allows you to do is it allows you to take advantage of not only time series historical data, so things like products, revenue, units sold, etc. It allows you to bring external, operational, and non-financial drivers into the mix to better enhance and better predict what the future performance looks like. So let's have a look at what the wizard actually walks us through. The first step in the predictive process is to set up our predictive model. So what this looks like is a series of guided steps, as I alluded to, with the Jedox Predictive Wizard. So step one in that process is to take an existing model. So in this case, as David mentioned, we're taking one of our marketplace data models, which is the bike information, and we're taking advantage of the key business structure. So Jedox automatically looks at the data model and says, yep, this relates to products. Some of the interesting drivers here are things like the weather conditions, the working days, the date and time, and all the different measures that we have captured within our model. It'll flag any sort of concerns around the data that might be worth fixing potentially, but that's the step one, is to understand and validate the data model that we want to use. So once we've identified the data source and the model that we want to use for our predictive solution, the second step is all around how do we actually set the drivers and the parameters that we want to use for our predictive model. Now, this conversation in itself is a really interesting one. Driver selection is certainly not a trivial concept or a trivial matter, because what we're trying to understand here is really what are the drivers that are likely worth investigating and worth analyzing that actually have an impact on our units sold, for example. So let's assume in this case that we've performed that driver analysis and we're starting to set our parameters. So what you can see here is we identify first the time horizon. We can set this at the annual level all the way down to the daily level, but this is saying I want to use some of our historical data for 2018, 19, and 20. We want to use our actual indicators of performance, and we want to predict what our future outlook looks like. We can capture as many scenarios as we want here, so we can create more scenarios, more predictive outputs that we want here. But let's say that our key prediction is, our scenario is what we call the prediction scenario here. Next, we want to bring in the external drivers. So this is where we can choose from a whole host of drivers that we have within the model. Now, we can see here that there's different drivers, everything from wind speed to humidity, to things like average unit retail, staff utilization rate, conversion rate, footfall, a lot of the typical metrics that you might think of in a retail or in the biker's best context. An interesting driver that I recently saw that Germany, the German government was taking advantage of was they've essentially put in an initiative to expand bikeways. Given that in the current circumstances, in the current situation, social distancing is being enforced for the right reasons, in order for business operations to continue, bikeway expansion is a key initiative that's being rolled out. So how can we leverage some of that information? Where the bikeways are being rolled out? What are the locations? Are they close proximity to some of our stores? Are there customers there that might actually walk into our store and might be interested in products? This is the kind of information that we may want to leverage that are external, operational, or non-financial drivers that might have an impact on our prediction. The two drivers, however, that I want to focus on for today's conversation are what we've identified as new cases, so new cases of COVID-19, and the amount of testing, so the per capita testing that is being conducted. Now, why are these two drivers particularly interesting? These two drivers are particularly interesting, obviously, given the current circumstances, but because, as you can imagine, in a retail context, you're not able to get customers in, you're not able to sell units unless you've actually got some of these social distancing measures relaxed. And so the ability for the government to relax these conditions are heavily dependent on new cases and the testing being conducted. So that's the logic behind why we're using these drivers. So once we've selected our drivers and the horizon that we want to use for our prediction, we can choose the granularity that we want to run the prediction for. We're saying in this case, excuse me, we're saying in this case that we want to run the prediction for all the individual intersection points, so the total picture. Once we're happy with our granularity and our drivers, we can identify what the target, what the outlook for our prediction looks like. Do we want a monthly prediction? Do we want a daily prediction? And how far into the future do we want to go? Obviously, there's an element of how much information around the drivers, things like testing information, unit information, how much information do we actually have in order to predict, say, 24 months into the future as opposed to 12 months. Now, the last interesting piece of this puzzle, the last step here is identifying what algorithm, what predictive model we want to apply to the data set that we have. So as you can imagine, predictive modeling is all about the data. It's all about how we can leverage the right technologies for the right data to give us the most accurate prediction. What Jedox has out of the box here are a host of different predictive models. So predictive algorithms, things like the linear regression model, random forest, support vector machines. There's a whole host of predictive models that are built into the solution, and new models are constantly being added. But what Jedox does to make the end user's life, to make Sam's life that much easier, is it allows her to pick the best choice. Jedox will automatically run the prediction for all the models, and it will return the best prediction. So whatever model fits the data the best, it will use that algorithm, it will use that model to run the prediction for you. Once we're happy with our filters, we can go ahead and set our parameters and execute our prediction. So what's actually happening right now? What's happening right now is once we've executed our predictions based on the parameters, it's essentially going to take all of the data that we have here and run a couple of different predictive scenarios. I've used two different sets of data for today's example. One that leads to a more optimistic U curve or a V curve, if you will, and one that's a less optimistic outlook on what the future could look like. What it also does is it ties the predictive model that we've created here back to our integrated planning solution that we have. So let's first tackle the prediction. What does the output actually look like for us? So when I preview the result here, Jedox provides an out-of-the-box preview of what our outlook actually looks like. You can see here that we've got the ability to choose what KPI. In this case, we're trying to predict the units that we're selling for all of our products, and we can choose what scenario we want to look at our prediction for. So we have two scenarios, as I alluded to for this example. What we can see then is, to begin with, I'm just going to hide away some of these other fields. We can see that we've got our historical performance, and we can see that we're trailing from a unit sales perspective right around the 2,100 unit mark for December, October, and November 2019. So what we would expect is the unit sales sits around that point to start off with in 2020. But then we'll start introducing some of our external drivers into this model. So we have new cases, for example. In our first outlook, in our first scenario, what we see here is the number of cases detected. Testing starts around the January mark, and we see a steep rise in the number of tests, in the number of cases that are being detected. And we see that this case growth peaks right around the March, April area, and then there's slowly a drop off with time as well. Now, it's really important that we overlay this with the amount of testing being conducted. Otherwise, we're lulling ourselves into a false sense of comfort, because the testing is what's really going to drive the reliability of the number of tests, the number of cases that are being detected. So we notice here from a testing perspective that testing slowly ramps up and it reaches a peak capacity of around, let's say, 1.1 million tests that are being conducted monthly. And once we reach this peak capacity, we know that we're reliably testing all the people, and we can see that the number of new cases is dropping off as we expect. So what does that mean from a prediction perspective? From a prediction perspective, then, you would anticipate that the number of units sold rises as it already was on an upward trajectory, but then there's a sharp drop off as social distancing measures are enforced until it reaches a bottoming out point, and then there's slowly an uplift again. But in order for this uplift to actually take place, we need to leverage as a business a lot of strategic intervention. So things like taking advantage of online channels, understanding if we can better position and better stock the right kinds of products on store shelves to better increase the unit sales. But what this allows us to see is what our outlook can look like based on the data set from these external drivers that we've captured. We've also put together a second scenario. In the second scenario, as you would expect, it's a bit more of a grim outlook. We can see that there is an uplift in our cases. It sort of starts to roll off again, but then there's a restart or an uplift once again in the number of new cases. Our testing once again is imperative. So we keep the testing in place, making sure that the testing is reliable and the number of tests conducted are a good indicator of the new cases. And we see once again now that there's an increase in new cases. And this is something that is likely going to continue till the end of the financial year. So what does that mean from our prediction? From a prediction perspective, then unfortunately, we see once again there's a drop off in our unit sales, starts to see an uplift, but then unfortunately, once again, there is a reduction. But this is where we can take this prediction as a starting point. We can take this prediction as a starting point, as a guiding post for what the future could look like, but then intervene with the right strategic measures. So what does that mean? Once we've done our prediction, Sam now has a starting point. She knows realistically with different outlooks, with different scenarios, what the unit sales will likely look like for different stores and products. So what Jedox then does is it ties back the prediction that we saw back to her existing integrated planning solution. So what I'll do is I'll go into our planning template. So Sam uses this planning template, for example, to look at all of her revenue for different stores and products broken down into different categories. So once again, as is part and parcel of a planning solution like Jedox, we cater for scenario modeling. So in this example, we've tied the budget version for 2020 with the predictions that we have from our previous solution, from our predictive model. And we can see here that we've got all of our stores broken down across geographies, broken down to the state level, down to the individual store level. So let's say we drill down to this particular store that Sam is interested in performing a bit more analysis on. The first thing that will catch Sam's eye is the fact that of the product offerings that we offer, because we've leveraged the deeper data set, she's able to go down to the product level and to the store level and see what the predicted outlook looks like. First and foremost, I can speak for Australia, and it's a particularly wonderful sunny day that we're seeing out at the moment. And you typically expect, with good weather conditions like these, that this time of year, you'd expect mountain bikes, you'd expect outdoor equipment to really sell. But the first thing she'll notice is there's a sharp downturn in the number of units that are being sold for a product like this, just because this is not something that people are interested in buying, given the economic conditions and the distancing in place. But what she's noticed is other products, stationary bikes, spin bikes, indoor exercise equipment is something that is likely to see a sharp uplift given the economic conditions. So what this allows her to do is see exactly where for each particular store the units sold are likely to see uplifts or downturns across all of her product offerings. But in addition to using this prediction as a starting point, Sam's smart. Sam realizes that a prediction is not a silver bullet. A prediction is always a guiding post of what the future can look like. So she has the ability to make targeted adjustments and changes based on strategic initiatives in the organization. So she might say, tell you what, it doesn't make sense given that this location is particularly close to a zone that is very hard hit. And so we're just going to avoid actually selling mountain bikes, for example, in this store. And so I'm just going to go ahead and make a change and wipe out my existing outlook for units sold for that product, for example. But she might say, to make up for that, I'm anticipating a lot more people investing in these other products. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an increase. And this is where a lot of the planning and the budgeting capability that Jedox provides can go a long way. So she might say, I'm going to increase by 10%, and I'm going to increase by 15% my unit sales for these two other products, taking advantage of the predictive starting point. In this manner, what she can do is she can make changes, and keep in mind throughout this planning process, it's really important that she collaborates with other planners and other stakeholders within the business. So Jedox provides things like the commentary and chat window to share ideas and share justification for how she's going about her decisions. Sam can take advantage of the audit capability, where any changes that she makes, she can drill the history to see who's made the changes, what were the previous values, and why is she changing them to the new values. She can have multiple people. So you could have store owners, store managers, product owners from multiple groups in real time planning for their individual slice of the world. And Jedox can in real time aggregate all of the information and consolidate all of these budgets for her. Last but not least, the final piece to the puzzle is how we can put a really flexible but a really important governance process around her planning. So in her current Excel spreadsheet world, she might have to send around a lot of emails, send around a lot of files, and actually get verbal or written approval for a lot of her decision making. But what she can do by taking advantage of the workflow component in the Jedox solution is centralize all of that workflow and governance within the solution. So what she can do is from right here, she can go ahead and say plan submitted. And once she's done her data entry, she can submit her budgets for approval and review. And once she's submitted them, you'll notice that everything's locked in, so she can't make changes, and now it's for the approver to review her budgets. The person responsible can then come into the workflow monitor and review the changes she's made and get a bird's eye view of how her planning is currently going. So why is this workflow monitor so powerful? It's really powerful because this allows the business to model different processes. So everything from the sales planning to the resource planning to the human resources cost center planning. The COVID-19 situation is not going to, in isolation, impact just their revenue forecasting. It's going to impact the labor plans. They're going to have fewer staff at the stores as a result. So she can manage all of these plans. She can manage all of the workflow and the approval process right over here. Things like managing who's responsible for activities, the due dates associated with activities, setting up email notifications. All of this process can be done over here. And anytime changes are being made, so for example, let's go to New South Wales, where she's planning for a particular store. You can see that as changes are being made, it tells you that the last activity that was the plan was sent. It tells you when the next activity is. It gives you a really clear picture of how the planning process is likely going to look. And from right over here, the administrator can approve the plan, can see any relevant commentary associated with the approvals and rejections, and everything gets tied back to their planning process and to their workflow at the same time. So then once she's gone ahead and done her scenario modeling, she's made the adjustments, she's gone through the due diligence around the workflow, the approval process, Jedox completes that last mile for her around tying her integrated plan back to the P&L. So what we'll see here from a P&L perspective is she can then reflect on her P&L, look at the revenue line, and look at all the different forecasts, the scenarios that she might have done, as well as the budget for 2020 that she was just working on. And then her predictive plan with the adjustments gets tied back to her P&L. So just like that, she's gone through the process of producing her predictive plan, dealing with the more realistic, maybe the optimistic outlook, but potentially the unpleasant outcome of a prolonged pandemic or a prolonged crisis situation. And she's allowed for the right planning measures in place. And most importantly, she's tied everything back to the financial view of the world. And she's helped the CFO align operations with strategy. That's it from me. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Arun. That was very clear, comprehensive, and compelling. So we're on the last mile of our presentation now. Our planner, Sam, can now share robust scenarios. She can collaborate in real time with stakeholders. It's no longer just locked away in a spreadsheet, but it can be used to drive behavior around the organization. And with the predictive and AI-assisted planning, she can quickly recalibrate the performance in response to new information. Now, we picked one slice or one example. We used retail because most people intuitively understand it. And we picked sales because it's something that we're all seeing at the moment with store closures. But the value of models and the power of models is that you can plug these together like Lego, and you can build up a comprehensive picture. So after Sam's solved problems around the forecasting and the revenue side, she can look at the supply side, she can look at capital investments, she can look at workforce utilization, productivity, and ultimately see the information cascade through to P&L, balance sheet, and the all-important at the moment cash flow. So that's the power of models, and they apply equally from a retail perspective to health industry, local government, professional services. Models are designed to be flexible so you can apply them to your specific use cases. Now, Sam was simply a character, but in the real world, we're hearing how many of you and many of our customers are playing key roles in our organizations. And many ordinary folks are taking the lead to lead and chart their organization through the uncertainty Now, whether that's by continually responding quickly beyond normal contingency plans with top-down and bottom-up, like this group financial controller, or whether it's by adding more operational insight into the plans so they can push it all right down to the supply and the materials used by this director of performance controlling, or whether it's by combining the short-term liquidity and financial planning with the long-term strategic and capital implications like this FP&A manager. These are all ways that we're seeing real-world organizations and real-world folks in all planning capacities make their organizations work more effectively and help them mitigate risk. And now to close, I want to let you in on some thinking of ours here at Jedox. On one hand, we know from our customers how important it is to get more robust scenario planning, how adding AI can really improve the quality of the decision-making process. And being in the cloud, it can be surprisingly easy to get fast results that make a difference. But on the other hand, it can be all too easy to bury our head in our spreadsheets, work harder in response to short-term pressure rather than sitting up and saying, let's make the world a better place. And this is why we've thought about this and designed an approach to help you solve an urgent challenge by taking what we call a slice of your process and using this for diligence and a business case, and to give you hands-on experience to make a change in your organization. We call this approach boot camp. And like everything else at the moment, this is online. But the concept of the boot camp is very simple. This is how it works. Firstly, you register your interest. So you'll get a survey after this webinar. You can register your interest in it. We run what we call a clarity or discovery workshop online with our experts. Folks like Arun that you heard before really know his stuff. They enable you to have pragmatic discussions, select use cases that can really make a difference, and then we get to work. We set up the data in your models, we provide you access from the cloud and give you hands-on guidance and support. And then it's over to you, you make a decision. So what I'd like to leave you with before we move to Q&A is to have a think about your priorities from your industry, from your sector, from your particular line of business, and let's plan to make things better.
Great. Thank you, David, so much and Arun for the presentation. So now we're on to the floor for some questions, and we do see a few of them here. So here we actually see someone actually asked, you've mentioned spreadsheets before, and they're really curious to find out if they are still able to use their spreadsheets.
Yeah, yeah, I'll pick this one up, Arun. That's a good point. We had the presentation last week or a couple of weeks back. We covered some content. If you didn't see that, we made some decisive choices about what we'd show and not show today. But really, we have a philosophy at Jedox about minimizing disruption, maximizing adoption, and that's about working where folks are already experts. And probably the biggest place is a spreadsheet. So, but the difference is rather than working in your spreadsheet offline, you connect it through to the cloud. You have an enterprise model inside Jedox, so everyone's collaboratively working on those same scenarios, but you can do it through office productivity tools that you're already familiar with.
Great, thanks for that. And the other question is actually, how do you actually get your data into Jedox?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that's in the context of what we talked about for today's session around leveraging deeper and broader sets of data for the driver-based predictive model. That's a great question. Really, predictive modeling and AI is really all about the data, right? That's 70% of the work, if you will. And this is the part of the journey that Jedox really makes simpler. And that's basically by taking advantage of the Jedox integrator. It has a whole host of connections for everything from ERP systems, cloud systems, on-premise systems. And basically, it allows you to take all of this data, combine it in some way, massage it, and then it allows you to then use the predictive model. But Jedox handles a lot of that data prep and a lot of that data integration into our model.
Brilliant, that helps. And here, this is a very valid and relevant one. So when we talk about AI and stuff like that, how is it actually a necessity to learn a new skill on how to use and leverage on AI and predictive?
Yeah, I think I'll take that one as well, David. That's another good question. I think the reality is the AI is not easy thing. It's not a simple thing necessarily to do, right? But where Jedox has made the solution that much simpler for the average finance user is it's built this guided approach, right? So the wizard that we talked about, where it essentially walks you from the data stage all the way through to the filters, the drivers, the timing. It walks you through all of that in a really user-friendly interface, and then it gives you a prediction. Now, there's a lot more that can be done after that, of course, but it's about basically making that journey really simple without the need for complex predictive skills or AI knowledge and things like that.
Brilliant. And here we do have another one. Do models actually work for different industries?
Yeah, I might pick that up, Christine. I've also seen some questions around case studies for sales, finance suite, or for HR models, and so on. And absolutely, we have a concept of a marketplace, and these whole different models that are put together either by Jedox, which are typically around functional use cases, or by partners, which are around specific domains, like industry use cases. And with any of these ones, we can certainly share some more detailed and granular examples.
Okay. I can actually see here a question as well about, we've only seen the demo for the driver-based model. What about the time series model? Can you explain that in a bit more detail? So as I sort of alluded to at the start of the conversation, really the focus was around depth and having broader data sets, right? So what the time series model does, it walks you through a very similar guided interface to the driver-based model, but instead of trying to ingest external data, the time series is all about bringing in historical performance, cleaning up the data, dealing with things like outlier detection, interpolation, and then essentially predicting what the future is from a time series perspective. In fact, there's even more statistical models for the time series that are now being translated for the driver series model. So it's less about bringing in external drivers. It's more about taking advantage of history to predict what the future is. That's all about the time series model.
Brilliant. Well, I think we do have some time for one last question here. Actually, so how much does the bootcamp actually cost? This is probably for David.
That's a good one. Yeah, I skirted around that one. Look, what I can say is that it depends on some items. It can range from free to a fairly modest investment, depending on a bunch of scenarios. So we'll certainly be in touch. You can register your interest, and we'll certainly be in touch with each and every one of you to really understand your specific situation, your drivers for change, and see how we can help you.
Well, we do see a few more questions coming in, but unfortunately we are running a little bit out of time. But fret not, please, because we will be in touch with you personally after this and be in touch with you to answer all of the questions that you may have. So please feel free to use the rest of the time here to post your questions, and we will be in touch shortly. And with that, we'd like to close off the Q&A. And we hope you have actually gained new insights and found today's Lunchtime Digest webinar relating to business continuity in the current situation and times helpful. Well, we definitely look forward to seeing you in our next session, where we're going to be addressing the topic on how we can align financial and operational plans accurately and efficiently. That's it for today's session. And if you have more questions, you know our contact. Please feel free to reach out to us at any point in time. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Please stay safe and please stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.